she said, "I'll work your fields, master, just feed my starving children." The wind, a mournful whisper across the fallow expanse of Elias Thorne's land, carried the scent of dust and distant rain, a familiar perfume of solitude. For years, it had been his only constant companion, a presence as weathered and unyielding as the man himself. His heart, a fortress built of loss and silence, knew no other rhythm than the turn of seasons and the ache of memory. The town of Redemption, a cruel irony of a name, lay a day's ride away, a place he visited only when necessity's teeth bit too deep. It was there, amidst the cacophony of market day, that the wind brought a different sound, a tremor in the stale air of his existence. He saw her first as a silhouette against the harsh midday sun, a woman bowed but not broken, a fiercely protective shield around too small a shadows. Lyra. Her name, he would learn later, was as soft as the moss that clung to the north side of his ancient oaks, yet it held the resilience of stone. She was surrounded, a pack of grinning jackals disguised as townsfolk, their words like stones cast at a wounded bird. A portly merchant, his face a sneer of petty authority, jabbed a thick finger towards her, his voice oily with contempt. "Thief! Vagrant! We'll have no more of your kind befouling our town." Lyra did not speak, her gaze fixed on something beyond their faces, a horizon only she could see. Her arms tightened around the children, Ilara, barely 6, whose eyes, wide and dark, missed nothing, and Finn, a wisp of a boy, clinging to her worn skirt, his small face buried in its folds. Elias watched, his hand resting on the worn axe handle tucked into his belt, a familiar weight. The scene was an old one, humanity's ugliness replayed on countless stages. But the tremor in Finn's small shoulders, the way Ilara's chin trembled despite her rigid stance, these were new barbs in his calloused soul. He moved, not with conscious thought, but with an instinct long dormant. His shadow fell over the merchant, eclipsing the man's righteous fury. Elias was not a large man, but decades of solitude and hard labor had carved him into something elemental, something the townsfolk instinctively understood as dangerous. "What's the trouble here?" His voice was rust, grating, and unused. The merchant, flustered, puffed himself up. This woman. She was trying to steal bread. Her brats are probably riddled with disease." Lyra's head snapped up, a spark of fire in her exhausted eyes. "We asked. We did not steal." Her voice was low, threaded with a weariness that went bone deep, yet clear as a winter stream. Elias looked at the children, at the hollows beneath their eyes, the smudges of dirt on their cherubic faces. He saw not thieves, but the ghosts of a hunger he, too, had known in a different, long-ago life. He turned back to the merchant, his gaze flat. He reached into his worn leather pouch, pulled out 3 silver coins, far more than the bread was worth, and dropped them onto the merchant's stall. They clattered with a finality that silenced the murmurs. "She works for me now," Elias stated, the word simple, irrevocable. He didn't look at Lyra, didn't wait for an answer from anyone. He simply turned and began to walk towards his wagon. A beat of silence, then a desperate, hopeful whisper. "Master." He stopped, but did not turn. "I'll work your fields, master. I'll do anything. Just feed my starving children." The word "a master" struck him like a blow, a brand of a life he wanted no part of. He said nothing, only waited. He heard the scuff of worn shoes, the faint whisper of cloth. He felt their presence behind him, a fragile cargo of hope and fear. The journey to his farm was a tapestry woven of silence. Lyra sat stiffly on the wagon seat, the children huddled between them, Ilara's watchful eyes flitting from Elias's stoic profile to the passing landscape, Finn eventually succumbing to an exhausted sleep against his sister's small shoulder. Elias felt their vulnerability like a physical weight, a stark contrast to the familiar emptiness of his life. His farm was a testament to his solitude. A sturdy but unadorned cabin, a barn leaning slightly with age, fields that yielded enough but no more. It was a place of work, not comfort. He led them to a small, disused outbuilding, cleaner than it looked, with a rough cot and a fireplace. "Here," he said, his voice still rough. He brought water, a loaf of the bread he'd bought, a piece of cheese. He left them, the unspoken hanging heavy in the air. Later, from his porch, he watched. Lyra did not rest. After ensuring the children ate, their small hands reaching with a pitiful eagerness, she emerged. She found a discarded broom and began to sweep the packed earth before her door. She inspected the loose shutter on the window, tested the handle of the water pump. Her movements were economical, purposeful. There was no hesitation, only a quiet industry. As dusk painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading gold, she coaxed a small fire to life in the outbuilding's hearth, its light a fragile beacon in the encroaching darkness. Elias ate his solitary meal, the familiar silence of his cabin now punctuated by the awareness of 3 other heartbeats on his land. Pity, he'd felt that in town. But watching Lyra move, seeing the fierce, unwavering resolve in the set of her shoulders, a different emotion began to stir. Respect. And a profound, unsettling curiosity about the storm she had weathered to arrive at his desolate doorstep. The unspoken agreement settled over them like the morning mist. She worked. He provided. Words were an extravagance neither seemed to require. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise painting the eastern sky with a promise Elias had long forgotten to notice. The rhythm of the farm, once a solitary drumbeat, now held a subtle counterpoint. Lyra rose before him, the scent of wood smoke from her small cabin often the first thing to greet him. She did not confine herself to the tasks he implicitly assigned. He found the sagging gate to the vegetable patch mended with salvaged wire, its hinges oiled. His own meager garden, long neglected beyond basic sustenance, began to show signs of her tending, weeds pulled, soil turned, tender new seedlings he hadn't planted appearing in neat rows. She moved with a quiet competence that spoke of a life spent making something from nothing. She mended his torn work shirts, the stitches small and neat, leaving them folded on his porch. In return, he left extra rations of flour, a side of smoked bacon, a length of sturdy cloth he'd found forgotten in a trunk. He never acknowledged her additions to his life, nor she his. It was a language of gesture, of needs met before they were voiced. The children remained shadows, flitting at the edges of his perception. Elara, with her mother's watchful eyes, would sometimes pause in her silent play of arranging pebbles or drawing in the dust to observe him, her expression unreadable. Finn, smaller, more skittish, would occasionally offer a fleeting, terrified glance before burrowing back into the perceived safety of Lyra's presence. Elias made no effort to approach them, sensing their fear was a wild thing, not to be cornered. He simply existed, a stoic fixture in their new, fragile landscape. He began to leave small, inconsequential things where Elara might find them, a brightly colored feather, a strangely shaped stone, a discarded wooden block that might, with imagination, become a house or a horse. He never saw her take them, but they would be gone when he next passed. Lyra's silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel, holding untold stories, unexpressed grief. Elias found himself watching her more often than he intended. The way her hands, though chapped and work-worn, moved with a surprising grace as she kneaded dough or sorted herbs she'd gathered from the woods. The unwavering line of her jaw when a task was particularly difficult. There was a fierce pride in her, a refusal to be entirely broken, that resonated with something deep within him, something he thought had died long ago. The first crack in their silent world came not with a storm, but with a cry in the night. A fever had taken hold of Finn, his small body racked with shudders, his breath shallow and quick. Elias was woken by Lyra's desperate, muffled sobs, a sound that pierced the thick walls of his cabin and his heart. He found her cradling Finn, her face a mask of anguish in the flickering firelight. "He burns," she whispered, her voice raw. "I have nothing." Elias, for the first time, stepped fully into their space, his presence filling the small cabin. He felt Finn's forehead. The heat was alarming. Without a word, he went to his own cabin, returning with a jar of willow bark tea, a remedy his own mother had used. He built up their fire, showed Lyra how to brew the tea, how to bathe Finn's small limbs with cool water. They worked together through the long night, a silent, desperate vigil. Lyra, her fear a palpable thing, nonetheless followed his quiet instructions, her hand surprisingly steady. As dawn approached, Finn's fever began to break. His breathing eased, his small body relaxing into a true sleep. Lyra slumped against the wall, exhaustion and relief warring on her face. Elias watched her, the harsh lines around his own mouth softening almost imperceptibly. He had seen her strength in labor, her resilience in hardship. Now he saw her vulnerability, the fierce, consuming love of a mother. Later that day, as the sun climbed high, Finn sleeping peacefully, Lyra found Elias by the creek, mending a fishing net. She stood for a long moment, watching the sure, methodical movement of his hands. They took everything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, addressed to the flowing water as much as to him. My husband, he believed the whispers. That we were cursed. Elara asks too many questions, they said. Finn, too quiet. Not like other children, she paused, her breath catching. They drove us out. Said we'd bring blight to the village. Elias didn't stop his work, but his hand stilled for a moment. He offered no false comfort, no easy words. He simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But in that nod, Lyra felt something shift. An understanding. A shared acknowledgement of the cruelty of the world, and perhaps, the faintest glimmer of shared sanctuary. The next morning, a roughly carved wooden bird, smoothed by calloused hands, lay on the step of Lyra's cabin. Finn, when he woke, clutched it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world, a small, hesitant smile gracing his lips for the first time in Elias's presence. The silence between them remained, but it was different now, less a wall and more a quiet space, holding the unspoken weight of shared experience. The fragile piece of their isolated world was not destined to last. The turning leaves of autumn brought with them the need for supplies, for salt and flour and iron, things the farm could not provide. Elias had put off the journey to redemption as long as possible, a knot of unease tightening in his gut at the thought of exposing Lyra and the children to the town's venom again. But winter was a harsh master, unforgiving of unpreparedness. He considered leaving them, but the memory of Finn's fever, of Lyra's desperate face, stayed his hand. And a deeper, unacknowledged reluctance to leave her, even for a few days. He decided Lyra would accompany him. Elara, though young, had a solemn maturity about her. He instructed her to keep Finn inside, to bolt the door, to speak to no one. Lyra, her face pale but resolved, agreed. She bundled Finn in Elias's old coat, kissed Elara's forehead, her eyes conveying a mother's silent litany of warnings and love. The town, when they reached it, was as unwelcoming as a nest of disturbed hornets. Whispers followed them like shadows, eyes like flinty arrowheads. Elias felt Lyra flinch beside him, her hand instinctively going to the worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders, as if to ward off their malice. He kept his expression impassive, his gaze fixed ahead, but his awareness of her silent struggle, was acute. The merchant, Geris, whose stall Elias had approached that first day, spotted them. A smirk spread across his fleshy face. Well, well. Look what the wind blew in. Still got your charity case, Thorn? Or has she bewitched you proper? Elias ignored him, moving towards the general store, but Geris was not so easily dismissed. He stepped into their path, his bulk blocking the narrow boardwalk. Some folks are saying you're harboring more than just a vagrant, Thorn. Some say she's unnatural. Those brats of hers too. Lyra's breath hitched, but she stood her ground, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. Elias felt a cold anger rise within him, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in years. Before he could speak, the town's constable, a man named Thorn, no relation, a fact Elias always found grimly amusing, ambled towards them. Constable Thorn was a man who valued order above justice, and public opinion above all else. Elias, he said, his tone attempting a weary authority. There's talk. Unsettling talk. About this woman. Her children. People are concerned about what, Thorn? Elias's voice was dangerously quiet. That I offer food and shelter to a woman and her children? Is that against the law in redemption now? It's irregular, the constable hedged, clearly uncomfortable under Elias's direct gaze. She's an outsider. They're different. It makes folks uneasy. For the good of the community, perhaps it's best if she moved on. Garrus, emboldened by the constable's presence, sneered. Yeah, Thorn. Get rid of the trash. Before she taints us all, he reached out, as if to grab Lyra's arm. In that instant, something snapped in Elias. He moved with a speed that belied his years, his hand clamping around Garrus's wrist like an iron band. Garrus yelped, his bravado deflating. That's enough, Elias said, his voice low and guttural, resonating with a power that silenced the gathering crowd. He released Garrus, who stumbled back, rubbing his wrist. Elias turned to face the constable, to face the circle of hostile, watching eyes. For too long, he had lived in the shadows, his voice muted by grief and isolation. Now, it found its strength. This woman, he began, his gaze sweeping over them, finally resting on Lyra, whose eyes were wide, shining with an emotion he couldn't name. Her name is Lyra. She has worked my land, tended my home, with more honesty and dedication than any two of you put together. He gestured towards the silent, judgmental faces. You speak of community? Of decency? I see little of it here. I see fear. I see cruelty born of ignorance. His voice rose, carrying over the stunned silence. She and her children have earned their place. They have suffered enough at the hands of people like you. This is my land. My home. And they will stay. He paused, his eyes locking with Constable Thorn's. If anyone has a problem with that, they answer to me. There was no mistaking the challenge, the absolute finality in his tone. The crowd shifted, murmured, but no one met his gaze. Constable Thorn, red-faced and flustered, muttered something about maintaining peace and backed away. Garrus, nursing his wrist, glared but said nothing more. Elias turned to Lyra. Her face was illuminated by a profound, incredulous gratitude. He saw the shimmer of unshed tears in her eyes, but also a new strength, a reflection of the stand he had just taken. He offered her his arm, a gesture so foreign to him it felt monumental. Let's get what we came for, he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness, but the unspoken resonated between them. He had not just offered her protection, he had claimed her, and her children, as part of his world, publicly and unequivocally. Their bond, forged in silence and shared labor, was now sealed in defiance. As they walked towards the store, the whispers that followed them were different now, tinged with fear, with grudging respect, and perhaps, for the first time, a sliver of doubt in their own righteousness. Lyra's step, beside him, was lighter than he had ever known it. The stand Elias took in town did not end the threat, it merely drove it underground, where it festered like a hidden wound. Garrus, humiliated and vengeful, along with a few like-minded townsmen nursing grievances real or imagined, saw Elias's farm not as a sanctuary, but as an affront. They saw Lyra as a blight, her quiet resilience a mockery of their fear-fueled superstitions. The whispers grew louder in the tavern, fueled by cheap ale and malice. They spoke of stolen goods, of dark magic, of the need to cleanse the Thorn homestead. The climax arrived not with the subtlety of changing seasons, but with the brutal clarity of a winter storm, an unnatural squall that swept in with little warning, mirroring the tempest brewing in the hearts of men. It was a night of howling wind and driving sleet, the kind of night that blurred the lines between the wild and the tamed, when the thin veneer of civilization felt most fragile. Inside Elias's cabin, a warmth Lyra had cultivated now permeated the space. Finn slept soundly in a small bed Elias had fashioned, Lyra reading by the firelight from a worn book of fables he'd unearthed. Lyra mended, her needle moving with a steady rhythm, while Elias sharpened his axe, the rhythmic rasp of stone on steel a counterpoint to the wind's fury. A sudden, frantic barking from Blue, Elias's old hound, shattered the peace. The dog, usually placid, was at the door, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias was instantly alert. He exchanged a look with Lyra. Her eyes, wide and knowing, reflected his own grim understanding. They were not alone. He unbarred the door, peering into the swirling sleet. Figures, dark against the white, were moving towards the cabin, torches guttering in the wind. Garrus. And at least 4 others, armed with clubs and pitchforks. Stay inside, bolt the door behind me. Keep the children away from the windows, Elias commanded, his voice tight. He grabbed his axe, his face a grim mask. Lyra's hand shot out, gripping his arm. Her eyes were not filled with fear, but with an intense, focused light. "The root cellar," she said, her voice urgent, low. "The old entrance, behind the woodpile. I cleared it. It leads out to the creek bed. They won't look there." Elias stared at her. He'd forgotten about that entrance, long since collapsed and overgrown. Her foresight, her quiet preparation, stunned him. He nodded, a surge of fierce pride, of something akin to awe, cutting through his anger. "Go. Take them." But Lyra shook her head. "You'll need help. Elara can get Finn there. She knows the way." She turned to her daughter, her voice calm, firm. "Elara, my brave girl. Take Finn. Quickly. Be silent. Wait for us by the old willow." Elara, her small face pale but resolute, nodded once, her eyes mirroring her mother's courage. She took Finn's hand, pulling him from his sleepy confusion, whispering reassurances. Lyra pressed a small bundle, bread, a blanket, into Elara's hands. Then, she turned back to Elias, picking up a heavy iron poker from the hearth. "We defend our home," she said simply. The attackers were at the door, their drunken shouts carried on the wind. Elias met the first one, Geras, with a roar, his axe a silver blur. The fight was brutal, desperate. Elias, fueled by a righteous fury, fought like a cornered bear, but they were outnumbered. A blow from a club caught him on the shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down his arm. He stumbled, and another man lunged. It was then that Lyra moved. She was not a warrior, but she possessed a wild, untamed spirit, a mother's ferocity. She swung the poker, connecting with the side of an attacker's head, sending him sprawling. Her sudden, unexpected intervention gave Elias the moment he needed to recover. But another attacker, seeing Lyra, lunged for her, a cruel leer on his face. Elias roared, trying to get to her, but he was engaged. Suddenly, a small, piercing scream cut through the chaos. "Elara!" She stood at the edge of the clearing, near the woodpile, not cowering, but pointing, her voice thin but clear over the wind. "Fire! The barn! They've set the barn on fire!" The attackers hesitated, their attention diverted. The barn, full of hay and dry timber, was going up like a torch, flames leaping into the storm-tossed sky, casting an eerie, dancing light. In that moment of distraction, Lyra acted with uncanny intuition. She grabbed a bucket of icy water kept by the door and flung its contents not at an attacker, but at the base of the largest, sputtering torch held by one of the men. It hissed and died, plunging their immediate vicinity into deeper shadow, confusing them further. Elias pressed his advantage, driving them back from the cabin. The sight of the burning barn, the ferocity of Elias and Lyra, and perhaps the sheer unexpectedness of a child's courage, seemed to break their drunken resolve. They were thugs, not soldiers. With curses and panicked shouts, they began to retreat, Geras casting one last venomous look before disappearing into the swirling sleet and darkness. Elias leaned heavily on his axe, his shoulder screaming, the smell of smoke acrid in his lungs. Lyra was beside him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the poker still clutched in her hand. They had held. They had survived. He looked at the burning barn, a symbol of his past, now turning to ash. Then he looked at Lyra, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that something far more precious had been saved. The first pale light of dawn crept over a ravaged landscape. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world cloaked in an eerie silence, broken only by the mournful crackle of the smouldering barn and the drip of melting sleet from the eaves of the cabin. Elias sat heavily on the cabin steps, his injured shoulder crudely bandaged by Lyra's surprisingly deft hands. Pain throbbed with every beat of his heart, but it was a distant ache compared to the turmoil within him. Lyra emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his, a fleeting touch that sent a tremor through his weary frame. She had found Elara and Finn by the creek bed, cold and terrified, but safe. They were now asleep inside, exhaustion having finally claimed them. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the smoke curl lazily into the grey sky. The devastation was stark, the barn, his tools, a season's worth of hay, all gone. Yet, looking at Lyra, at the quiet strength in her profile as she gazed at the ruins, Elias felt not despair, but a strange, unbidden sense of peace. The things he had lost were mere wood and iron. The things he had defended, the things she had helped him save, these were alive, breathing, infinitely more precious. He turned to her, the words he needed to say forming slowly, painfully, like thawing earth. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, his emotions long buried beneath layers of grief and solitude. "Lyra," he began, his voice hoarse, raw from the smoke and the night's exertions. She met his gaze, her eyes clear, waiting. He gestured vaguely towards the fields, towards the cabin, towards the smouldering ruins and the untouched forest beyond. This place, it was just land. Just a place to be alone. He paused, searching for the right words, words that could convey the shift within him, the new landscape of his heart. You and the children," he took a ragged breath. "You made it a home." He looked down at his calloused hands, then back at her, his gaze direct, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in decades. "Stay, Lyra. Not just for shelter. Not just for work." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the step beside him. Her skin was cool, but a warmth spread from her touch, chasing away the lingering chill of the night. "Stay," he repeated, his voice softer now, imbued with a plea he hadn't known he was capable of. "With me. Make this our home." Together Lyra's eyes, those deep pools of resilience and sorrow, slowly filled with tears. But these were not the tears of grief he had witnessed before. A fragile, luminous smile touched her lips, a dawn breaking across her face. She didn't speak for a moment, her gaze holding his, a silent conversation passing between them that transcended words. Then, she turned her hand beneath his, her fingers lacing with his, a firm, sure grip. "Elias," she whispered, his name a soft melody, a promise. Yes, the word was simple, yet it held the weight of a lifetime, the promise of a shared future. In the quiet aftermath of violence and fear, in the ashes of what was, a new foundation was laid, built not of timber and stone, but of courage, trust, and a love as tenacious and resilient as the wild herbs she coaxed from the unforgiving soil. Months later, spring breathed new life into the Thorn homestead. Where the barn once stood, a smaller, sturdier structure was rising, built by Elias's hands with Lyra often beside him, passing tools, offering quiet suggestions. The fields, plowed and planted, promised a bounty richer than any Elias had known alone. Flowers Lyra had planted in salvaged tins and cracked pots bloomed in vibrant defiance along the cabin walls, their colors a stark contrast to the monochrome existence Elias had once endured. Elara, her initial shyness replaced by a quiet confidence, now read aloud to Finn in the evenings, her voice clear and sweet, filling the cabin with stories of faraway lands and brave heroes. Finn, no longer a shadow, trailed Elias around the farm, his small hands helping with chores, his laughter a sound as natural and welcome as the chirping of crickets. Elias himself was a changed man. The harsh lines around his eyes had softened, smoothed by Lyra's presence, by the children's innocent affection. A smile, once a forgotten expression, now came more easily, especially when his gaze fell on Lyra as she moved through her day, a quiet song in her heart. She was the calm center of their world, her intuitive wisdom a source of strength and comfort. Her knowledge of plants and healing had become known, albeit grudgingly at first, in the wider, scattered community. People from distant homesteads, hearing tales of her skills, sometimes made the journey to seek her help for ailments the town doctor couldn't cure. They found not a witch, but a woman of quiet grace and profound understanding. The town of Redemption kept its distance. Geras and his cronies had faded into the bitter obscurity they deserved. Some townsfolk still whispered, but now their words were tinged with awe, with a reluctant respect for the family that had faced down darkness and emerged stronger. Elias and Lyra's love was a quiet river, flowing deep and sure beneath the surface of their days. It was in the shared glance over the supper table, the comfortable silence as they watched the sunset paint the sky, a hand reached out in the darkness of night. It was a love built not on grand declarations, but on shared burdens, mutual respect, and the profound, enduring miracle of finding sanctuary in another's heart. Their home, once a bastion of solitude, was now a haven of peace, a testament to the enduring power of love to heal, to rebuild, and to make the desolate bloom. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, where do we find the courage to offer sanctuary? And when given, how does that fragile seed of kindness blossom into a love that can heal not just two souls, but the very land they walk upon? The heart knows its home when silence speaks louder than any vow, and shared burdens become shared strength. If their story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales of resilience and the quiet power of love. Let us know in the comments what true sanctuary means to you.